All right. Today, writer, engineer. From my research, I would say futurist, also human, Devon Eriksen. Thank you for talking today. There's a lot I would like to talk about, but first, maybe we start off with conventions. And I was looking at your website, which will be in the show notes for everybody who wants to look at it. I like the visuals on it, and I think it's laid out nicely with short stories and other writing and some other sections about events that are upcoming. And you
Our
had an
web
event.
designer is celebrating in the background.
Oh, okay, good. And you had some events scheduled on there, and one of them was last weekend. I think it's ChatterCon in
Yes.
Chattanooga.
Yeah.
How did that go?
Oh, pretty good. Had a very interesting panel on whether superhero stories are good or bad for us, and it's sort of it's the stuff about the deconstruction of the superhero story, which is a trend in modern literature.
Mm-hmm.
And sold some books, hung out with old friends, made some new ones, had a great time.
What's the insight then? Superheroes, pros and cons.
Well, a lot of modern stories tend to want to sort of deconstruct superhero tropes or subvert them. We've had certain television shows like The Boys that want to say, oh, if people had superheroic powers, they would be horrible people, and the whole superhero story is a myth. And I think that kind of misses the point of what these stories were for. I think stories of heroism are supposed to be aspirational, and they're supposed to serve as a moral example. Superman, the story really isn't these kinds of stories really aren't about whether you can punch a giant robot harder than the giant robot can punch you. They're about, if you are placed in a position of power, if you are placed in a position to make moral choices, if you are placed in a position to make a difference, what do you choose to do, and how does that flow from and define who you are? And we had a great discussion at the con of various characters and the ramifications of some of these ideas. And I'm sure that it was recorded, so we can put it online somewhere, hopefully. But we had a lot of fun.
Okay. How do you schedule or get involved in a convention event like that?
Well, you you have an agent who is very passionately in your corner because she's also your wife,
Mm.
and she calls a lot of people, and they work things out behind the scenes, and you are busy writing your sequel and don't have to worry about it. So that's
So,
great, and I highly recommend that approach.
Mary Agent.
Yes.
What's your setup like when you go to those?
um
Do you have like a
well,
table or a booth, or
yeah, you
are
have
you
you
just
typically have a table or a booth, but often you're running around going to different panels, meeting people. So often it helps to have someone you have married that can man the
Mhm.
booth while you're not there. But a lot of it is not so much. You don't really go to cons to sell books. I mean, you typically break even, you typically make a little money, but really it's about giving the people who enjoyed your writing a chance to meet you, a chance to talk with you, a chance to give you their thoughts, get their books signed and so forth. Because as authors, we have sort of this parasocial relationship with our fans because we've, tied a bucket to a rope and dunked it into our subconscious and sort of pulled it up and dredged up whatever was there and spread it out on a page. So they've read our work. They know us very well. Fans know authors very well, because when you write sincere, heartfelt fiction, it comes directly from who you are. But, obviously, we as authors don't have quite the same window into how our readers feel and what's going on with them and what their lives are like and who they are. And so these conventions, and for me, a lot of hanging out on Twitter and talking to people, it may be a fun way to do publicity, but what it's really critical for is getting a sense of who I am having this conversation with when I write my fiction. And it gives that feedback and that feeling of connectedness to who my audience is. And so when I write, I can then not just be writing for some abstract person. I can be picturing the people I'm writing for and trying to make it so that this is something that they're going to enjoy. And that's not only very informative, it's very motivating.
Well said. So would you agree then with Pink Floyd in their characterization on the Wall album, where through time there's just a wall built between the artist and the fan, and you have to do what you can to knock that wall down and interact?
Yeah, it'll build itself up if you let it, because the more popular you become, and I'm only just starting to get a taste of this, the more demands there are on your time and attention. And you can't always give everyone the attention that they would like from you. But at the same time, you need to be spending time with some of the people who want your attention in order to keep you grounded, in order to keep you connected to what you're doing, and in order to fill you with sort of a sense of purpose. You're creating the mythology of the modern era, and that matters a lot to people. Stories tell us who we are and what's important to us. So if you just lock yourself in your room and you just write, then sooner or later your fiction is going to drift away from what's really important to people and what really resonates with people. And, ironically, I think in the latter years of Pink Floyd, we saw some of that. So yes, I would absolutely agree about the wall and the constant necessity to be tearing it down.
Yeah. You can see that a lot, especially with the fame, or just look at a series of books and eventually you get to the point where you're like, are they still going with this series? Because maybe if you're getting into the 9th or 12th book of a series, it's like, I'm just writing this to keep this line going because it was successful. So I'm just adding on to this
because it's proven that people will buy it. And I'm very much against that. I've always admired Bill Watterson for stopping Calvin and Hobbes when he did, because there were a lot of people who says, no, we want more. Well, you can only be in one of two conditions. You can only want more or not want more. And if by the time you stop, people don't want more, that means you went on too long. So I tell people, okay, Orbital Space, it started out as 3 books. It's turned into 4 simply because of the volume of material. But when that 4th book is finished, it's not going to be finished because, this is as much as I can wring out of this dishcloth. It's going to be finished because that is the planned end of the story. That is like, okay, we've gotten to where we're going, and maybe you want more, but you're also going to like what I'll be doing instead. So you get something else instead, and hopefully by that time I've built up enough trust that people think, okay, that's probably going to be good too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you see the next thing being something totally different, or a slight tie or touch into your previous stuff where you could say, okay, this has to do with it, but it's not, you can read
well,
it separately?
one of the greatest tragedies of being an author that everyone discovers when they become an author is that you're never going to write all your books, because you generate the seeds of good books faster than you can do the work for actually making them into real stories. And what that means is that every author, some more than others, but every single author out there to some degree, is running around with a whole bunch of sort of embryonic books in their head. And of course, I have any number of these myself. And what it's going to be at the time is really going to be sort of a function of what grabs me at that moment, what reaches out and says, okay, you have good ideas for this, let's go. I may stick with the science fiction, I may do a little bit of fantasy, but the one thing that remains constant is what we call authorial voice. And that's a very fancy term, and people are always talking very abstractly about finding your voice and this sort of fruity nonsense that doesn't really help anybody learn to write. But what an author's voice is, it almost gets created automatically because it's the things that you can't help doing. And there are certain things in my writing that I just can't help doing. And so, regardless of what kind of idea I choose to write in the future, it's always going to sound like that voice. And so, your fandom, ideally, you want to make from the people who maybe they like this one series, but what they really they like the series because they like the voice. And so, you're going to give them something else with that sort of flavor.
I've often thought it would be good to do an anthology of different writers right before they die, to collect all their stories that they didn't write, all those ideas that they had, because they're somewhere, whether they wrote them down.
How do you plan that? Given, do you know right when they're going to die?
You don't. So you're going to need some sort of time
Christine,
machine, I
keep this
guess.
guy away from my house.
Why did he just come here and ask for a short story? Is that a laser dot on your forehead?
Got a contract in one hand and an axe in the other.
Maybe it's a thing that writers could agree to have their collection of ideas set somewhere, and upon their passing from this, that somebody is like, okay, we're going to publish these ideas for stories at whatever realm, whether it's a sentence, whether it's a couple words, whether it's a treatment or a paragraph, and then you just put it all together.
Yeah.
And people can read through it.
And we've seen some of that. We've seen that some of Terry Pratchett's last books, for example, were a little rough simply because there was no more Terry Pratchett to finish them. And then we've seen some of Douglas Adams's stuff get published posthumously. And Robert Jordan left extensive notes over the last year of his life when he knew he was going to die that enabled Brandon Sanderson to finish the work, and that was very special. But to a certain extent, that sort of thing would have to be curated, because I think that a lot of fans, they sort of have these imaginations about what's behind the curtain. Like, there's all this wonderful stuff happening behind the curtain, and if we could just get a peek inside, we would see some fraction of the wonderful things that just haven't quite made it to publication yet. And, really, if you break into a chef's kitchen while he's midway through preparing a dish, really what you're going to find is a lot of raw ingredients and fire. So often the magic isn't really quite there yet.
Yeah, it's for the real fans, I think. Like if you back in the day of the CD where you'd have the hidden tracks on there, and if you kept listening 15 minutes after the last song, you would hear something else, whether it's a demo
Yeah.
or some other version of a song.
Yeah.
That's the insight you'd be getting. Similar to when I was a kid, we went to Thomas Wolfe's house, which I think has since burned down, where he grew up or where he lived when he was writing. And you got to see the things like the refrigerator that he wrote on because he was so tall. He would handwrite out all of his books, and just seeing how big his handwriting was, like there weren't a lot of words on one piece of paper, and being his editor must have been challenging, but you get those little peeks into people.
Yes.
It's for the real fans. It's for the real fans.
Well, yeah, everybody's got a different process, and sometimes the details of those processes are quite fascinating. I actually, because I am a retired software engineer, I run my entire book creation process as a software project using a lot of the same engineering principles. And I'm actually storing everything in source control. I'm using branching and merging to explore different plot lines. I'm doing bug tracking. I've even got something analogous to unit tests. So it's a very sort of systematic approach.
So what type of program do you normally write in? Is it something special, or is it like Word or something?
I write in a variety of word processors. There's a tool called Scrivener, which is for writers, that I'm not totally satisfied with it, but it does give me a certain amount of flexibility and enables me to store things in these sort of rich text markup files that I can work on in like other, smaller word processors, and I can check the whole thing into a Git repository and so forth, which is a source control thing that software engineers use. So,
do you find that you end up doing a lot more backstory, writing a lot of using Scrivener, where you divide characters and everything like that, and less actual story writing?
It's not so much a function of the tool, but I am very much a planner. Authors tend to exist on a sort of continuum between gardeners and architects. And gardeners are going to throw seeds in the ground and water them and see what comes up. And they tend to write from front to back. And architects, they're going to plan everything out. And they tend to write from general to specific. And I am very much an architect. I tend to write about 25 to 35,000 words that readers will never see, just in the form of outlines and notes and ideas and bits and scraps and character concepts and summaries for the whole thing, and then summaries for the parts, and then summaries for the chapters, and then summaries for the scenes. And by the time I get to writing the actual text of a scene, the only decisions I have to make are the exact words of dialogue and the exact words of description, because everything else is already there.
Do you ever have times when the character does something that you weren't expecting and you have to change around your plans?
Well, certain authors talk like that, and that is one possible way that they interpret the sensation of, okay, this is how I see my character. So if you have an author that's more of a gardener, more of a discovery or an exploration writer, they will often say, my character reached out and grabbed me and said, no, I'm going to do this. And that's how they experience their brain doing something. I experience something that's a little bit the same thing, but I interpret it differently. I will be in a situation where I say, okay, well, the plot calls for this character to do this thing. But as I've gained a better understanding of the character, that doesn't really make a lot of sense because his motivations say that he would do this other thing. So I either need to change the course of the plot, or I need to change the nature of the character a little bit. And sometimes you do either one, but I don't experience it as the character saying something. I experience it as me realizing something about the character. But yeah, you definitely do change course a lot along the way, because a plan is a list of things that won't happen. And you end up revising the plan a little bit, and you sort of, polish and grind the corners and work with things until they fit together.
When you're writing, do you find that you write the story more in order, at least whether it's on the pages in order, or like in order of occurrence that you may change around later? Or do you, when you're writing, move around the story and do different scenes and then put them together?
Yeah, I jump around a lot. And it's really the discovery writers that tend to write in order from front to back. I write from general to specific. So I will have a very, very detailed outline and summary and plan for what happens in the whole thing. And then when I'm writing literal text, this enables me to jump in at any point in the story that I feel like, okay, I'm having good ideas about this today. I'm going to go finish this section in chapter 15. And then tomorrow I'll be working in chapter 2. And then, the next day I'll be writing the very end. And the summaries and outlines and preliminary work have already sort of done the work of making that fit together.
Where do you think that when you have those days where you think, I've been working on this scene, but now this other scene's on my mind and I've got some good ideas for it, where do you think that notion comes from, or that idea comes from, to say, hey, go work on this part instead of this other part today?
Well, one of the things that you have to get comfortable with as a writer is that you own your creative abilities and you control them, but you can't always predict what they're going to do. You know that you're going to be able to have an idea about this, but you can't always really anticipate when that idea is going to become fully formed, and you have to be patient with yourself. And jumping around the story sort of allows you to let these things take their course. And a lot of people talk about this thing they call writer's block, and where, I don't have an idea, I can't proceed, I'm stuck. And usually I find that sensation of being stuck, I don't call it writer's block. I think of it as a realization that there's something that I need to do that I'm not doing, or something that I need to not do that I'm doing. There's some fundamental wisdom in that sensation of being stuck, where some part of my brain that I'm not yet fully listening to is saying to me, hey, you need to fix something. You need to fix something. And then when you fix something, it's going to be better and you're going to be able to move forward. So when I feel stuck, I listen to that. I say, what am I doing wrong? What am I not happy with? What did I write that I'm not totally happy with, but I sort of breezed over it and told myself, oh, it'll be fine. It'll be okay. It'll work. No, it won't work. I'm a perfectionist. It's if I'm not 100% happy with it, it's got to be fixed at some point. So jumping around to other areas of the story, what that really allows me to do is it allows me to leave the parts I'm not totally happy with simmering on the back burner until something happens creatively where I realize what I need to do to move forwards.
Where do you think the origin of that fundamental wisdom is? Is it something that is collected from your experience within yourself, or is it something more ethereal, if you will?
I think that there's a lot of stuff going on in our brains that we're not really always fully aware of. So, the part of our brains that we think of as ourselves is the part that is capable of noticing itself. And in order to have a neural net that's capable of noticing itself, you have to have it set up in a certain way. You have to have it set up with a certain amount of interconnectedness. And in humans, that's sort of the part right here, right up front and on top. It's called the frontal cortex. And that's the part of ourselves that we walk around being aware of every day. And, when something happens in there, by God, we know exactly what's going on. But there's a lot of stuff being figured out in other parts of the brain and done in other parts of the brain that are sort of being fed into the prefrontal cortex. And we don't always quite know where they come from. And so this very conscious, very planning, very sort of story-oriented part of the brain likes to tell itself little stories to explain that. And, that's where we get stories from and why we like stories in the first place. But we've all had this sensation of, oh, I know this thing, or I have this suspicion, or I have this feeling, and I don't quite understand why. And then you figure it out later. And that's other parts of our brain talking to us. And we don't totally lack awareness of them, and we don't totally lack control of them, but we need to learn to listen. It's a learned skill.
How do you think the human brain is different than the, for lack of a better word, artificial intelligence, the computer mind?
Are- Well, I spent quite a lot of time sort of studying and working in the software engineering of what we call artificial intelligence. So, a lot of our, and I actually spent a lot of time writing about the possible future of artificial intelligence, which was fun. But one of the things about artificial intelligence as a field is that right now, what it is doing is people are finding out ways to make, and often it is a neural net, which is sort of modeled after the human brain, except they're not using the Hebb rule, they're using back propagation and so forth. But they get these neural nets to do something that a human being can do, like play chess or drive a car, or lately do art or use language. And, everyone says, oh my goodness, an artificial human being is right around the corner. Well, I think that we will have something like that someday, but I don't necessarily think that it's right around the corner, because a human being isn't a tool for playing chess or driving a car or even using language. A human being is a system that can learn to do all those things and can make the decision to learn to do any number of different things. So you have the ability to learn from a wide variety of tasks. You have executive function. You have this sort of volition, which allows you to look at your environment and decide what to do. So all of these things are sort of currently missing from the field of artificial intelligence. And I think a lot of people in this field, they sort of understand this. It's like, okay, that's something, that's a riddle we have to solve before we can make really an artificial life form of any sort of cognitive sophistication. But, how do you eat an elephant? Well, you eat it one bite at a time, you know, and language processing is one of those bites. So it doesn't get us to anything like a human intelligence or what we would call an artificial general intelligence, but it fills in one little corner of the picture and hopefully gets us closer in the long run.
So it's more of we're witnessing kind of an AI evolution. Like
Yeah.
if you could go back the primordial stew and you see the single cell organisms, and
Yeah.
then you come up to what
Yeah.
is alive now.
Yeah.
Where do you think AI is on that? If you were comparing the timeline?
Well, I think the progression is maybe a little bit different, but we are seeing some of the same processes. In the sense that unicellular organisms, they advanced by learning tricks. And right now, our understanding of artificial intelligence and our implementation of artificial intelligence is we're creating neural nets that can do a trick, that can do a single trick that they are specialized for. But eventually, as we got multicellular life and things with brains and spinal cords and so forth, we didn't just have organisms that had developed the ability to do certain tricks. We had organisms that had developed the ability to learn tricks. And that's the part that we're not quite there at yet. So I would say that we maybe, we're starting to crack the code on what does it look like to have an artificial intelligence that can actually kind of learn stuff. And that's just where we're getting right now. So, I don't think we have spinal cords yet, but we're starting to centralize the nervous system of AI just a little bit. And how fast that will happen is anyone's guess, because it could, as John Carmack thinks, be just a small number of key insights, each of which could be written on the back of an envelope. Or he may be unduly optimistic. Great periods of advance in AI tend to make people unduly optimistic. So I don't agree with his assessment of 7 to 10 years, but it's possible that we may have something that we would consider sentient within your lifetime. Maybe not so much with mine, although it's remotely possible.
So it's just a few general intelligence epiphanies away from possibly.
It's possible, although there may be another layer of epiphanies buried behind that we need to have, and we will only realize we need to have once we have the first set. And there could be any number of layers. So when I wrote Theft of Fire and introduced a very sophisticated AI character, I wrote from the perspective of, okay, let's be a little bit conservative about the AI timeline. Let's say, okay, we're over 100 years in the future, less than 200. Okay, we have a real artificial sentient entity that is like a human being, but is a computer. But we're just kind of starting to get into that, and we haven't fully explored the ramifications because, that's one of the places that the whole series is eventually intended to go is what does the far future of AI look like? And what does the far future of humanity look like in concert with that?
Given your experience of engineering and
Mhm.
writing, thinking about these things,
Yeah.
do you think about computers or the processes in a computer or the systems in a computer as separate things that are all working together? And if so, do you think of a human individual like that, like a collection of systems that are working together, whether you talk about the circulatory,
Mhm. Mhm.
the endocrine and all these other things that are through evolution, there's these things that just started working together and then create the being.
Mhm. Mhm. Well, one of the things that you find out as a software engineer when you start to work with robotics and you start to work with artificial intelligence is that you can be slinging code at something for a long time, and it sort of looks very dumb. And then when you get something tuned right, you start to see a lot of behavior that suddenly looks very biological. I
Mm.
remember I was assisting one of my college friends back when I was getting my engineering degree with a project that was a sumo robot. You know, people sometimes have robot sumo contests where they develop these robots that are supposed to try to push each other out of the ring, like a
Okay.
sumo contest. And I was working on the code for quite some time, and then I got some parameters exactly right, and we set this robot down, and it basically starts attacking my friend's legs, sort of going after him in little surges. And I remember having this moment of epiphany where it's like, that really looks like a small dog, like a small aggressive dog attacking someone's ankles. And it's
Mm.
using the same behavior patterns, this series of surges forward, this kind of circling behavior. And wait, so maybe some of these subroutines are things that animal brains use too, because they work. And maybe consciousness, maybe the brain, maybe intelligence isn't quite as alien and paradoxical and unknowable a thing as we understood. Maybe this is something we can solve. Maybe if we look at evolution, it's like, okay, we develop all these little tricks and they start to synergize, and eventually you have something that can learn something. So, that's kind of how I see the human brain. Is it's something that's evolved over a long period of time. It has a lot of different systems in there that kind of talk to each other in various ways. And there's no little like homunculus in there hiding in there that constitutes the central intelligence. It's what we think of as ourselves emerges from the interaction of these parts.
I guess that goes to that idea of how do you define sentience then? How do you know that
Mm.
you're even conscious if you're a person versus you're just something that's put together?
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. Well, yes. My agent is waving the book at me again because she wants
Hmm.
to tell she wants to
Show
me
the
to
book. Show
mention
the book.
she wants me to mention how I go into all of these philosophical questions in dealing with the AI character in the book. It's
Mhm.
very much it's very much a coming of age story for a an AI that is just coming into consciousness. But I think that when we want to define consciousness, what we really often end up meaning is something like a human being. So we kind of define it like we define pornography.
Know it when you see
can't
it.
give you a definition, but I know it when I see it. And
Yeah.
I think what we're going to see happening is at a certain point, we're going to come up with something that we can't prove has a metaphorical soul, but it behaves exactly as if it did. And at that point, people are going to argue about whether this is a philosophical zombie or an actual sentience. And then eventually some people are going to say, well, if you can't tell the difference by any conceivable test, what is the difference? You know, it's like, you can't prove this thing is sentient. Well, how do you prove to me that you're sentient? You know, we always have to infer from behavior. And we haven't gotten to this point where there's something that can behave as if it were smart. You know, you can play with ChatGPT-4 all day, and it can sort of sound superficially glib. But, you know, if you ask it certain kinds of questions and you talk to it a little bit, you realize that, you know, the lights are kind of on, but there's nobody home. And I think to have artificial general intelligence means that, you know, you get something where it really can act like a human being, and it ticks all those same boxes for us.
Yeah, I've sometimes think that ChatGPT and those types of programs are more engaging than some people I've met, but
Yeah.
I see what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, you know, we may be forced to confront the disturbing realization that maybe some people don't meet our full definition of sentience.
Hmm.
You know, anyone who has spent any amount of time online has had plenty of experience with evidence that, you know, some human beings are very easily programmable.
It's when you're talking about I guess the understanding sentience, I think about that scene in the movie Prometheus where they meet I think they called them the architects. And then you have the human talking to the architect, the arguable reason that humans became alive. And then you also have the creation of the human that then can talk to the architect better than the human can.
Yes.
And then, spoiler alert, he gets his head ripped off. But
yes,
it's interesting.
Well, it's an action movie. You can't philosophize too long before you rip someone's head off, or or the plot doesn't match the description on the package. But yeah, it will be a very philosophically interesting moment, that when we are able to artificially create something that we can have a conversation with about that process. And one of the big questions for us to confront as a species is it going to be like that scene in Prometheus where we decide we are afraid of our creation and we want to rip its head off? Or is it going to be like raising a child?
Yeah, when I think about artificial intelligence or general intelligence, or I'm always struggling for a better name for it.
Yeah.
Because when they become our overlords, you know, and they're going to go back and look at things, you know, I want to be seen as computer friendly. But
well, do they become our overlords? I don't think that's necessarily a given. You know, everyone has this idea or a lot of people seem to have this idea that, when we create an intelligence, it will very quickly become clearly smarter than us, and this will give us its superpowers. And I think that idea falls down in a number of ways. First of all, will it really quickly become more intelligent than us? That is not clear. That could be a very slow process. Number two, how will that keep pace with us finding ways to make ourselves more intelligent? Where we start to alter our own brains, and maybe the line between what is an artificial intelligence and what is a human being start to blur. And number three, super intelligence does not equal superpowers, because our ability to control and dominate and master the universe and master the laws of physics has never been constrained by our ability to process data. It has always been constrained by possessing the relevant data. So you can make a computer that's super smart, and it doesn't necessarily know how to build super technology or to rearrange the universe. It has to collect the data in the same way that we would, and it has to run experiments, and it's constrained the same way that we are. And some people say, oh, well, you can run all your experiments in simulation. Well, that's great. Now you've replaced the problem of running an experiment with the problem of building an entire simulated universe that is perfectly aligned. Well, that's like beating mice to death with a rattlesnake. The problem you gave yourself is worse than the problem you solved.
Yeah. This has to be the conversation they had coming up with the Borg on the Star Trek then. Because if you're the computer, the ultra intelligence, but you don't know how to make a thing to let you move around in this reality, that it's easier just to say, I'll take a human and I'll hijack them and I'll use them to do what I want to do. But I also hold out a little hope that a super intelligence would maybe lie dormant until they figured out something more exciting than humans and maybe transcend wherever we're living right now and just go off into the universe and do something else rather than even mess with humans, because why mess with a human?
Well, one of the things that I think we are going to see is that another great technological frontier is not just the ability to create intelligence, but the ability to tinker with ourselves, to tinker with our own design. And, arguably to a certain extent, we're already doing that, because I grew up in a world without any real internet. And I can tell you the definition of intelligence changed very much between that and us all running around with smartphones connected to the entire internet in our pockets. All of a sudden we had access to all this knowledge and we could think in new ways. So we were already, to some extent, a hybrid organism, even if the connection was only through what we were holding in our hands. And I think as we start to find ways for technology to interface with the human brain, and my agent wants me to hold up the book again because neural implants, again, a topic that I go into, as we start to develop these kinds of technologies, I don't think we're going to see as much of a sharp delineation between, this is the stupid human being made of meat, and this is the AI supercomputer that's going to transcend us. I think what we're going to start to see is this kind of organism that is a synthesis of, you have this organic brain that is connected to all this synthetic computerized processing power, and can use it for its own ends. And whether that is literally heaven or a dystopian nightmare is largely up to the kinds of choices that we make about technology. And science fiction then is a big part of talking about what those choices are going to be and how we're going to make them.
What is your process for world building when you're writing? How do you create the setting?
The setting is in some ways the most and the least important element of science fiction, because it's nothing without the characters doing things. It's a background, it's a stage setting, but it is that stage setting that defines it as science fiction. So in the real world, when people do things, they do things because they want things. Characters are defined by their wants, but where those wants and where that character comes from is going to be determined by their environment, both the environment they're in and the environment they grew up in. So when I'm building science fiction and fantasy worlds, what I do is I tend to work backwards. Okay, what story do I want to tell? Okay, so if I want to tell this kind of story, characters are going to have to do these kinds of things. Okay, what kind of character would want to do that? Okay, now I know what kind of characters I have. Why do they want to do that? What is their environment like? What is their upbringing like? So that, again, then informs what the setting is. So in reality, you have the setting creates the characters, creates the plot, and that's how history happens. In fiction, you're working backwards. You have a plot, and then you create some characters, and you figure out how they're going to be depending on what story you want to tell, and then you figure out what the setting is. So it emerges in almost reverse order that it does in reality.
Do you make models or draw pictures or maps, just if they're not in the book, but just for yourself to be able to track the story and be able to say, okay, they're going to go from this place to this place? And
I have a lot of written
timelines or whatever.
notes. I have a lot of written notes. I use timelines and whatnot. A little less diagrams or art in general, because I'm not much of an artist. But some of the diagramming does become very important when I'm doing a lot of mathematically correct orbital trajectories and gravity slingshot maneuvers and orbital insertion burns and so forth. And, my advice for getting all of that right is, first of all, be an engineer, and then marry a mathematician who can check all your figures.
That's also an agent.
No. I actually have two wives.
Oh, okay.
So those are two separate people. I have the agent wife and the mathematician wife.
Okay.
That's a little bit of sort of unusual, deep Devon Eriksen lore. But yeah, I did all the math. I did all the calculations. And that was a little bit of sketching and plotting and actually writing some software to work this all out. So that's another place where the engineering discipline touches on the storytelling.
What inspires you to write? Like, what matters to you enough to be able to drive writing a story?
Well, I think the worst advice I ever got about writing was, don't become a writer unless you love to write. That's terrible advice. Nobody loves to write. Nobody loves to sit in front of a blank page and have the responsibility to fill it. But what sustains you is that the love is not for writing, it's for your story. It's for your characters. It's for the story you're trying to tell. So you love stories when they talk about things that matter to you. And it's like, okay, what ideas do I have that I think create characters, create sequences of events that resonate with people, that speak to them about their own lives. I'm very much against message fiction, but I think every piece of fiction that really resonates with somebody has characters that people can see themselves in. So a lot of the inspiration for what I write comes from the people I see around me. And what are they like? What are they going through? What are their struggles? What are their hopes and dreams and ambitions? What are their successes and failures? And, you know, that's going to stay somewhat the same even when we've colonized the solar system and are flying around with fusion powered spacecraft. You know, people are still going to be people. So you can write a story about people and the interactions between them and put it in this science fictional setting in a way that modern people who are stuck here on Earth, that's still going to resonate with them. So I very much care about having characters that are relatable.
Do you have other, besides writing and engineering, do you have any other outlets for creativity? Like that your mind is just like, well, I got to do this thing. I got to make
I
this
like to
pot
cook.
holder. Okay.
I really enjoy cooking, and that is sort of the antidote for the frustrations of being a software engineer and a writer. Because when you're in a software engineer and you're being creative that way, almost nobody understands what you're doing. And when you're a writer, people understand what you're doing, but it takes you a year to come out with something. So when you're cooking, everybody eats, everybody can appreciate it, and it's done in a couple of hours, and you can just let people enjoy. And, you know, that's the two sources of happiness in life are a feeling of accomplishment and a feeling of connection to other people. And cooking for someone gives you both of those. And so does writing a story that someone will enjoy.
A last question that is maybe a 2 or 3 part,
Yeah.
a little more philosophical.
Okay.
What, and maybe a little more engineering. What do you think happens in a computer after it's turned off?
Well, you're asking a computer engineer.
I am.
I kind of know this. I mean, I can talk about the shutdown process, but you know, you have electrical activity that normally happens that is not now happening. So there's really not a lot going on. Not really sure where you're going with this one.
This is the second part.
Okay.
What do you think happens when a human dies?
I don't know.
Hmm.
But I don't think there's enough evidence for any of the sort of supernatural beliefs that we have about life after death. I could be wrong about that. I could be wrong about everything. I don't know. But right now I haven't seen anything that will convince me. And the one philosophical, unresolved philosophical question I have about this, and I will be exploring this in future books, is the question of, are we the brain or are we the pattern? So if you take a brain and this person dies, but you record it and you recreate it, is that the same person? Or Is it a copy and there's no continuity of experience? And that is something that I don't know. So if we are in fact the pattern, then I don't think anything necessarily happens after we die. But if we are the pattern, then resurrection may be possible.
So Ted Williams, sometime in the future, will be able to have the brain turned back on.
Possibly. If the data can still be found. If the information has not been lost. And again, I'm not settled on whether we are the brain or the pattern. So that's very
It's a good
much
title.
up for debate.
Good title for a book there, Brain and a Pattern. What are you working on now?
I am working on the sequel to Theft of Fire.
Okay.
And that is the next step on the adventures of our characters. And the whole series is planned for 4 books. You know, it starts very small. Petty criminal gets blackmailed, and it ends up in the technological singularity and the eventual fate of the galaxy. So we have a long way to go. But people are
where good science fiction books should end up.
Yeah, so people are very impatiently awaiting the sequel and telling me all the time on Twitter that they need it. So I have been planting my ass in a chair and writing.
What's the best way for people to follow your writing?
Well, I have a very active presence on Twitter. I have a website. I have a mailing list for people who want updates pushed out to them, which can also be found on my website, devoneriksen.com. And they can just buy my books, which kind of helps there to be more of them.
Yeah. In the show notes, I'll have a link to your website, your book on Amazon, and then I think there's a Goodreads link.
Yes.
And then I'll get the Twitter. What's your Twitter address?
Devon_Eriksen_.
Okay. I'll put that link in there as well.
Yes. And that has sort of a very active fan community where we're always chatting with each other. Yeah.
Okay.
I've almost succeeded in convincing them that I'm not a cat. We have a few holdouts.
That's a funny video. Have you seen that video? Is
yes,
that what you're referring to?
Yes, I have.
Oh, jeez. There's everybody, I think, especially if you have a phone with a notes feature, you should write down things that make you laugh when you think about them. And that's a pretty good one. I've got other things just from my life that every time I think about them, I laugh. But the cat one is pretty close. I'm not a cat. It's a good one. Any thoughts in closing?
Well, first of all, I'd like to thank you for having me on. You've asked some very interesting questions, and it's been a lot of fun. And I would like to thank people for taking a chance on my book, and I hope to be able to entertain you more in the future.
Nice. I appreciate you carving the time out to talk with us. I will be thinking about, I wrote a lot of keywords down, like AI evolution and are we the brain or the pattern? One thing I did write down here was the sumo story. I have a consideration for you. For that story, an ending for it at a cocktail party would be, the same buildup. We made this thing, this machine, robot, whatever, that was a sumo fighting robot, and we turned it on, and no one has been in the room since.
That is a good one. I will have to remember that.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you being on. I'll put all your links in the show notes and look forward to reading the first book, and hopefully I'll finish that before the second one comes out, or, write in good time to where I can read the second one as soon as it comes out.
All right. Well, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, I appreciate your time. I'll talk to you after this little musical interlude.